7 years is a long time to wear a lie on your face. Mara had learned this the way she learned most things, quietly, and without anyone to teach her. She had been 17 when she pressed the blade to her own cheek, in the small hours of a winter night with the fire burned low and her hands steadier than they had any right to be. She had not cried. She had looked at herself in the bronze mirror afterward, at the thin welling line that would become the scar that would become her life, and she had felt something she could only describe as relief. The scar ran from the outer corner of her left eye to the edge of her jaw. A long, deliberate arc. Not the rough, jagged mark of an accident or a battle. Anyone who looked closely enough could see it was too clean, too considered, too precise for something that had happened to her rather than something she had done. Most people did not look closely enough. They saw the scar and they looked away, which was exactly what she had intended. She was the third daughter of Lord Cassian of House Aldrich, a minor northern house with a proud name and a shrinking fortune. Her 2 older sisters had been married off by 20, both to respectable second sons of respectable houses, both producing children and stability, and the particular exhausted contentment of women who had been moved from one man's household to another's without being asked what they preferred. Mara had watched this and understood that her turn would come, and she had felt, not for the first time, the particular suffocating press of a future she had not chosen closing around her like walls. She was 17 when she heard her father discussing the mating bond with her uncle in the study she was not supposed to be near. Not discussing, negotiating. There was a young lord in the eastern province, recently come into his title, whose wolf had apparently identified a bond with a daughter of House Aldrich. The lord was wealthy, well-connected, politically useful. Her father was deeply interested. The young lord had apparently specified a preference for unmated women, which narrowed the field to Mara. The conversation moved from identification to value assessment to practical logistics in under 10 minutes, with her standing in the corridor outside the door, listening to herself be discussed like acreage. She had gone to her room and thought for a long time. The mating bond, once physically completed, could not be undone. She knew this. She also knew that a man seeking a mate could reject any woman who bore a mark the old traditions considered a defilement. Visible scarring above the collar was listed in 3 separate volumes of mating law as grounds for a bond declination, without penalty. She had read those volumes in her father's library during the years she had spent finding every legal protection available to a woman in her position, which were not many, but which were more than most women knew about. She had read. She had thought. She had made her decision. The scar served its purpose 3 times in the years that followed. 3 different potential mates, 3 different moments where a man's eyes had traveled to the left side of her face and she had watched the instinctive recoil, not always cruel, sometimes almost apologetic, occasionally accompanied by the particular discomfort of a man who wanted something he felt guilty for wanting and used the scar as permission to decline. She had received all 3 declinations with equanimity. She was 24 when the royal summons arrived. Every unmated female of noble blood between 18 and 25. The Alpha King required a queen. All qualifying women were to present themselves at the capital within the month. Mara read the summons twice. Then she folded it precisely and sat with it in her lap for a long time, looking out her window at the northern fields she had managed for 6 years, while her father's health declined. She thought about the Alpha King, Caius of House Valdrin. 28 years old. 3 border wars, 2 of them won decisively, and 1 ended by treaty. Rumored to be severe, contained, fair in his governance. Rumored also to be solitary, no known mistresses, no close companions, only the efficiency of a man who had been responsible for an entire kingdom since the age of 17 and had built his life entirely around the work of it. She thought about the mating bond in the mating law and the scar on her face, which had done its work faithfully for 7 years. She packed her traveling clothes and went, She told herself she was going because the summons was royal, and refusing it would create political problems for her father's house. This was true. She told herself the scar would do what it had always done. This was also true. Probably. She did not examine too closely the third reason, the one that arrived in the back of her mind and waited there quietly without making itself a problem. The simple, inadmissible fact that she was 24 years old and she was tired of lying. The capital city of Valdrin was 3 days' ride from the northern estate. Mara traveled with a single maid and 2 guards, practical and unhurried, stopping at decent inns and arriving at the capital on the morning of the 4th day when the light was still pale and the city was only beginning to open itself to the day. She had been to the capital twice before, both times as a child, and she had remembered it as enormous and loud and slightly overwhelming. She found now that it was still all of those things, but that she was no longer a child, and could therefore hold enormous and loud without being overwhelmed by them. The palace receiving hall was where the assembled women had been directed to gather, and Mara arrived to find approximately 40 women already present, ranging from the clearly nervous to the clearly strategic. Several of the northern families were represented. She recognized 2 women from court seasons she had attended in her early 20s, before the scar had made court seasons both pointless and uncomfortable. They recognized her, too. She watched the familiar trajectory of glances, face, scar, away, and felt the familiar neutrality she had trained herself to settle into. One of the receiving household staff directed her to a position in the arranged line. She found her place and stood with the particular stillness that 7 years of deliberate invisibility had made second nature. The Alpha King entered the hall 40 minutes later. She had expected presence. Every account she had heard of Caius of House Valdrin mentioned presence first, and everything else after. What she had not expected was the specific quality of it, not the performing dominance of nobles who needed you to know they were important, but something quieter and more fundamental, the way a mountain has presence not because it announces itself, but simply because it is there, and everything else arranges itself accordingly. He walked the line. He did not hurry. He moved with the particular patience of a man who had learned that rushing decisions was how you made bad ones, pausing briefly before each woman with an expression of focused, impersonal assessment. He was tall, dark-haired rather than the silver fair she had somehow expected, with features that were striking rather than conventionally handsome, a strong jaw, dark brows, eyes that were a deep amber brown rather than the cold pale shades she associated with northern alphas. He looked like someone who had spent more time outdoors than indoors, which, given 3 border wars, made sense. He was working his way toward her. She felt the bond before he reached her. It arrived like a weather change, a pressure shift, a new quality to the air, something her wolf recognized before her mind caught up to it. She had not felt this with any of the 3 previous men, had never actually felt a genuine bond, and had only theoretical knowledge of what it was supposed to feel like, and the reality of it was significantly more than the theory had suggested. It was not dramatic, it was not overwhelming, it was simply certain, the way a key turning in a lock is certain, a click, and then openness where there had been resistance. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him. He looked at her. For approximately 3 seconds, nothing happened except that the certainty between them was present and mutual and completely obvious to both of them, the way weather is obvious. Then his eyes moved to the left side of her face. She watched him see the scar. She watched his expression carefully, the way she always did, looking for the recoil, the recalibration, the particular shift that preceded a declination. His expression changed, yes, but not in the way she expected. He looked at the scar with a focus that was not repulsion, but something more intent, more considered, and then he looked back at her eyes, and she saw something in his face that she had never seen in any face that had looked at her scar before. He looked angry. Not at her. She had spent 7 years reading the faces of people reacting to the scar, and she was very good at identifying the direction of the emotion. He was not angry at her. He was angry on her behalf, or at least something in his expression had that quality. A tightening that was not disgust but its opposite, a sharpening of attention that moved toward rather than away. He said nothing. He moved on down the line. Mara stood very still and breathed with careful regularity and did not allow the fact that her heart was doing something entirely undignified to be visible in any external way. She waited for the declination. At the end of the review, when the king retired with his council to make his selection, she waited for the quiet withdrawal, the formal communication that would release her back to the north with no bond and no claim, and 7 more years of freedom if she wanted them. The household steward found her an hour later. His Majesty requests the presence of Lady Mara of House Aldrich in the private study, the steward said, in the carefully neutral tone of a man who had learned never to editorialize. Mara looked at him for a moment. She followed him through corridors she had not seen, up a staircase she did not know, to a door she had not expected to be standing in front of. She knocked. "Enter," said a voice on the other side, and she went in. The private study was a working room rather than a display room, maps on the walls with notations, a desk covered in actual documents rather than decorative ones, a fire in the hearth that was clearly there for warmth rather than atmosphere. The Alpha King was standing by the window with his back to her, and his hands clasped behind him, and he turned when she entered. They looked at each other. He said, "Who did that to you?" It was not a question. The silence that followed had weight to it. Mara stood just inside the door of the study and considered her options, which she did quickly and without visible deliberation because she had spent 7 years becoming very good at exactly this, the assessment of a situation in the moment it presented itself, without the luxury of time. She could tell the truth. She could deflect. She could perform the vague and practiced sadness she had used twice before when the question had come up in other, less significant contexts. An accident, she would say, years ago, and people generally accepted this because people generally preferred the version of a story that required nothing from them. She looked at Caius of House Valdrin, Alpha King of Artoria, who had just asked her who had done this to her with the specific tone of a person who intended to do something about the answer. "I did," she said. The room went very quiet. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, not the responses she was used to. Not any of them. He was working through something, she could see it in the set of his jaw, the careful steadiness of his amber eyes. "Sit down," he said. She did. He moved from the window to the chair across from her, and they sat in the study in the afternoon light, and he looked at her with the focused attention of a man who had decided to understand something and was giving it his full resources. "Tell me," he said, not as a command, as a request. She looked at him for a moment. Then, she told him about the corridor outside her father's study and the conversation she had not been meant to hear. She told him about the mating law volumes she had found in the library, and the cold winter night and the bronze mirror and the steadiness of her hands. She told him about the 3 declinations and the 7 years of managed invisibility, the fields she had farmed and the estate she had run, and the particular exhausted relief of being overlooked, which was nothing like peace but was the closest available approximation. She told it plainly, without asking for sympathy and without performing strength. She told it the way she had come to tell herself most things over the years, as fact, as information, as the shape of what had happened. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Caius was looking at her with an expression that was now entirely legible. Fury, the contained kind, the kind that has been organized rather than suppressed. It was not directed at her. She was certain of this. "You were 17, he said. "Yes, and your father knew you overheard." "I don't know. It didn't change the situation materially. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked. Then he said, more quietly, "It was your face." She held his gaze. Yes. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She had become very accustomed to being looked at, or rather, to being looked past, and being actually looked at was different enough that she had to consciously resist the impulse to turn her face slightly, which was what she had been doing for 7 years. She did not turn her face. She let him see all of it. He said, "Why did you come?" She had prepared for many questions. Not this one. She thought about deflecting again and found, sitting in this room with this man who had just heard the true version of her story without flinching away from it, that deflecting felt not just difficult but somehow wrong. Like lying to someone who had just proven they could handle the truth. "Because I'm tired," she said. She said it quietly, without drama. 7 years is a long time to make yourself disappear. His expression shifted. Not softened exactly, nothing about his face was built for softness, but opened slightly, the way a room opens when a window is uncovered. "The bond," he said carefully. "You felt it." "Yes, and the scar. You believed it would be grounds for declination. It has been before." He was quiet. Something moved in his face. He stood from his chair, and she thought he was going to the door, to summon someone, to begin some formal process, and then he crossed the room not toward the door, but toward her, and he crouched in front of her chair as she had seen no one crouch in front of anyone in any formal context in her life, so that they were level, eye to eye, and he looked at her directly with those amber eyes that were nothing like what she had expected. "I am not declining," he said. She looked at him. Her hands were very still in her lap. "I need you to understand that clearly," he said. "Not as a political statement, not as a formal declaration." He held her gaze. "I looked at you in that hall, and I felt the bond, and I looked at your face, and I saw the scar, and I understood, looking at it, that it was not something that happened to you." He paused. "I don't know yet what it means that you made it yourself," he said. "I don't know everything it tells me about 7 years of your life, but I know it tells me something about who you are, how you think, how you survive, how much you were willing to do to protect something you considered yours." He was very direct. "That is not something I want to look away from. That is something I want to understand." She sat in the chair in the afternoon light and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not gratitude exactly, and it was not relief exactly, and it was something that arrived too quickly for her to organize before it was already there. "Give me time," she said. Her voice was steady. "The bond is real, and I felt it, and I am not running from it. But I made a decision when I was 17 to stop being moved without being asked." She met his eyes. "I would like to be asked." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he rose from the crouch and held out his hand. "Formally," he said, "Lady Mara of House Aldrich, will you accept my courtship?" She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She took a long breath. She placed her hand in his. "Yes," she said. He gave her a suite of rooms in the eastern wing and a household staff of 3 and no particular schedule to keep. She had expected structure. She had expected the formal courtship proceedings she had read about in the same law volumes that had informed her about scarring provisions, the arranged meetings, the supervised visits, the careful public appearances designed to satisfy the court's appetite for evidence of appropriate feeling. She had prepared herself for all of this, had organized herself internally for a process that would be bureaucratic and visible and conducted largely for an audience. Caius appeared at her door the following morning, with no ceremony and no staff, and asked if she wanted to ride. She had stared at him for a moment. "I should tell you," he said. leaning against the doorframe with the easy posture of a man who did not require a room to rearrange itself for him, that I have very little patience for proceedings. If you need proceedings, I can arrange them. I find them inefficient. She considered him. Where would we ride? He had taken her to the eastern ridge, which was a 40-minute ride from the capital, and offered a view of the whole river valley below, the farmlands in patchwork gold and green, and the city itself reduced to something comprehensible in the distance. He had a specific spot. She could tell it was specific by the way he moved directly to it without looking for it. A flat outcropping of pale stone with a natural seat worn into the far edge where someone had clearly sat many times before. She had sat there and looked out at the valley and felt, for the first time in years, a quality of space that was different from solitude. Solitude was what she had built for herself out of necessity. This was something else, the particular spaciousness of being somewhere with someone who was not demanding anything from the moment. He sat beside her and looked at the valley too. After a while he said, "How much of the estate have you been managing yourself?" She glanced at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the farmland below with the specific attention of someone who was actually asking about farmland. "All of it, for 6 years," she said. "My father manages the social calendar when he's well enough. I manage everything else." He nodded. "You had to learn it yourself, mostly. Our steward is competent. He taught me what he knew, and I found the rest in the library." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We have a problem with the northern grain distribution." He said it conversationally, without preamble. The distribution routes from 3 northern provinces cross 4 different toll jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction applies different rate calculations, and nobody has yet found a way to standardize them without the local lords taking it as a centralization threat. She looked at the farmland. "How long has it been a problem?" 8 years. My father started it, and I inherited it. Who benefits from the current inefficiency? He looked at her then. "The toll collectors," he said. "Obviously. And the 2 largest northern houses who have enough political weight to negotiate favorable terms, and therefore no particular incentive to see the system changed." She thought about this. The smaller northern lords must resent it. Enormously. But they don't have the coordination to push back collectively. Then you don't change the system, she said. You give the smaller lords a different reason to coordinate, something that makes collective action natural rather than manufactured. She paused. Shared infrastructure, maybe. A road or an irrigation project that benefits them specifically and requires joint maintenance agreements. Once they're coordinating on that, the tariff conversation becomes easier. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hadn't thought of it that way." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she was learning, the specific quality of his attention when he was absorbing something and finding it useful. "You're good at this," he said. "I've been managing a border estate for 6 years," she said. "The resources are limited. You get good at finding approaches that don't require you to have more than you have." He nodded slowly. They sat in the pale morning on the outcropping above the valley, and she talked about northern agricultural economics, and he asked questions that were specific and intelligent, and occasionally pushed back on her thinking in ways that made her revise it, and 2 hours passed in what felt like 20 minutes. On the ride back, she noticed him looking at her scar twice. Not with the familiar recoil, with something she still had not fully identified, a quality of attention that was careful and present and moved toward rather than away. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "When I see you looking." He considered this with the directness she was beginning to understand was characteristic. "No," he said. "It bothers me that it exists. The distinction is important." She looked at the road ahead. "They're different things." "Yes," he said. "Very." She thought about this for the rest of the ride. She was not accustomed to distinctions being made on her behalf, She was not accustomed to anyone looking at the scar and finding the anger it produced landing somewhere useful rather than simply closing the interaction. She noticed that she kept waiting for the moment when the looking would become something else. Pity. Or revision. Or the comfortable categorization of her as damaged rather than someone who had made a choice, and the moment kept not arriving. She thought about that too. On the 5th evening, she found a book on the table in her sitting room. It was not a decorative book. It was not new. It was a worn, heavily annotated volume. She could see the marginalia before she even opened it, cramped and urgent notes in dark ink, and when she opened the cover she saw the title, Northern Agricultural Systems and Sovereign Policy Conflicts, 3rd edition. It was not a romantic gesture. It was clearly a working text, clearly used, clearly his, placed there because he had thought she would find it useful. She sat with it in the lamplight and read for 2 hours, and found that his annotations were, consistently, the most interesting thing on each page. She came to breakfast the following morning with 3 questions about a specific passage in Chapter 7, and he listened to all 3 with the focused patience that was becoming familiar, and answered them in order, and then asked one in return that she had not considered, and they argued about northern soil degradation policy for 45 minutes over food that went mostly cold. It was the best breakfast she had eaten in 7 years. They had fallen into a pattern by the 2nd week that neither of them had engineered, and neither of them commented on. Mornings were for riding or the library. She had been given unrestricted access, which she had not asked for, and which had appeared silently as a fact, like most of the things he arranged. Afternoons were sometimes together and sometimes separate. Depending on his council schedule and her own work, she had brought estate correspondence and continued managing her father's land from the capital, which he had not questioned, and which she had expected to require explanation. Evenings were the sitting room, both of them working, the fire low, the lamps bright, the comfortable, productive quiet of 2 people who had discovered that parallel silence was its own form of conversation. He was not a man who performed. She had identified this early, and it remained true in every context. He did not arrange his expression for effect, did not moderate his opinions for palatability, did not speak more than the situation required. She found this extraordinary, in the precise sense of the word. It was outside her ordinary experience. Every formal relationship of her adult life had been managed, mediated, performed to some degree. Even her own behavior had been a performance of a kind. The scar, the invisibility, the studied neutrality. Caius simply was what he was and moved through rooms accordingly. She was not sure yet what to do with this. She found herself watching him sometimes with the same focused attention he directed at her, cataloging the specifics of how he operated, the way he listened, fully and without performing listening, which meant she could see him actually thinking rather than organizing his response while she spoke. The way he disagreed, which was direct and without apology, but also without contempt. He told her when he thought she was wrong and explained why, and then listened to her counter-argument with the same quality of attention as the original point. The way he looked at her. The looking was consistent. Not constant. He did not stare. It was nothing like that. But present. When she spoke, he looked at her face the way most people looked at the person they were speaking with, without the detour, without the sideways drift toward the scar, and then away. He looked at her face, including the scar, in the same way one looks at a whole thing, rather than cataloging its parts. She was not used to this. She did not know how to be used to it quickly. On the 12th day, she came to find him in the library and found him already there with 2 documents open side by side, and an expression of focused frustration that she had not seen before. She sat down across from him without announcing herself. He glanced up, the frustration not leaving his face but making room for her alongside it. "Trade agreement," he said. "Southern ports. The language in Article 11 creates a conflict with existing Northern shipping rights, and nobody in my legal counsel wants to be the one to tell the Southern delegation that we need to revise it, because it means admitting we let it through the first review. She held out her hand. He passed her the document. She read Article 11. Read it again. Looked at the Northern Shipping Rights Charter he had opened beside it. The conflict is real, she said. But it's narrow. It only applies to cargo that originates north of the ridgeline and is destined for southern ports without interim offloading. How much cargo fits that specific description? He was quiet for a moment. Not much. Maybe 12% of current trade volume. Then, you address only that category, she said. You don't revise Article 11. You add a supplementary clause that creates an exemption for northern origin cargo specifically, frame it as an accommodation for the existing charter rather than a conflict with the new agreement, and nobody has to admit anything. He looked at her. That solves it, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment longer. You think this way quickly. I've had limited resources for a long time, she said. You learn to find the solution that doesn't cost more than you have. He nodded. Then he said, without looking away, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me if it's too early to ask. She put the document down. Ask. The scar, he said. Does it cause you pain? Physical pain, still. She looked at him. Not for years, she said. It healed cleanly. He nodded. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was containing something. She had learned this too. I want to understand, he said carefully, what it meant for you to live with it, not the reason you made it. I understand the reason. He held her gaze. What it was like. 7 years. She was quiet for a moment. This was not a question she had ever been asked. Most people, upon learning the scar was self-inflicted, either stepped back from the topic with discomfort or moved immediately into analysis of the decision, the act itself. No one had asked about the living with it. She told him. She told him about learning to enter rooms leading with her right side, about the particular performance of social invisibility, the careful management of where she stood in relation to light sources, about the moments it had been harder, a winter evening when she had been 20 and briefly, dangerously close to lonely enough to want it gone, and had talked herself back from the edge of that with the cold practicality that had always been her most reliable resource. About the slow, strange way she had made peace with it, not as a wound but as a choice, as evidence that she had once looked at a situation and found a solution and committed to it entirely. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I'm glad you're here, he said. His voice was low. It was plainly exactly what it was, no performance, no embellishment. I am glad you came instead of staying away. She looked at his face in the library light. So am I, she said, and meant it. The court had opinions. She had expected this. Courts always had opinions, and she had walked into his great hall with a visible scar on her face in traveling clothes and been subsequently installed in the Eastern Wing Suite, and the combination of these facts was more than enough material for the particular industry of noble speculation. She heard it in corridors, not directed at her but not entirely concealed either, the way people speak when they want to be overheard without the accountability of being seen to speak. The scarred girl. The northern border, nobody. Why her, of all possible choices? There had been women of real political families in that hall, women of wealth and connection and conventional beauty. Why the ruined one? Mara listened to these things with the equanimity of someone who had been listening to variations of them for 7 years and had long since stopped deriving her sense of self from external assessments. They were information, not verdicts. She catalogued them as she catalogued everything, with attention, without attachment. What she had not expected was chaos. She had not expected that he would hear the same things she heard. She assumed he was insulated from corridor whispers by the particular altitude of kingship, and she had definitely not expected what happened on the Thursday of the second week when she was crossing the east gallery with her estate correspondence, and she heard his voice in the room ahead, low and precise and carrying a quality she had not heard in it before. She stopped walking. She had become familiar enough with his voice to hear the difference. In conversation with her, it was direct and unornamented. In counsel, it was authoritative and measured. This was neither of those things. This was the voice of a man who had decided something and was delivering the decision without negotiation. She could not make out the words. She moved slightly closer to the doorway, which was not entirely appropriate and which she did anyway. She caught the last part. Will not be discussed in this palace in those terms again. Is that understood? Then silence. Then footsteps, and she moved quickly away from the door, and she heard him emerge behind her, and she turned and they looked at each other in the east gallery. His expression was composed. He was very good at composed. She raised her eyebrows slightly. He said, "Some of my advisors had opinions about the selection." She nodded. "And now?" "They have been invited to redirect their analytical energies toward the trade agreement with the southern ports." He paused. "I found a use for the frustration." She looked at him for a moment. "You didn't need to do that." His expression shifted. Not much, but enough. "I know," he said. She understood the difference. He had done it not because he thought she needed protection, but because he had wanted to, because something in him had required it for reasons that were his own. She thought about this for a long time after they parted in the gallery. She thought about it again that evening in the sitting room when they were both working, and he looked up once, briefly, and caught her looking at him, and the moment held for 2 seconds before both of them returned to their work, and nothing was said, and everything had shifted anyway. On the 15th day he took her to the old treaty hall. It was a room she had not known existed, below the main palace, accessed through a corridor off the lower library, stone-walled and low-ceilinged and extremely cold, lined with the original documents of every treaty and declaration and land charter signed by the House of Valdrin for 300 years. He brought a lamp. She brought her coat. "This is where we keep the actual history," he said, "not the arranged version." She moved along the shelves slowly, reading labels. Her breath was visible in the cold air. He walked beside her without hurrying her, holding the lamp at the angle that would give her the best light. She stopped at a particular shelf. "These are the Northern Land Records." "Yes." "Including the original border charters." "Yes." She looked at him. She thought of 17 families and disputed claims and the years she had spent managing around the consequences of decisions made in rooms like this one. "Will you let me read them?" He handed her the lamp. "Take as long as you need," he said. "I'll be here." She read for 2 hours. He sat on the floor with his back against the stone wall, and his long legs stretched out, and his own eyes closed. Not sleeping, just present. And the lamplight made small, warm circles in the cold dark, and she read the actual history of the northern borders and found everything she had suspected confirmed, and several things she had not suspected. And when she was done, she sat down beside him on the cold floor with the documents in her lap. He opened his eyes. "There are 14 separate land misclassifications," she said, "going back 60 years. Not aggressive, not obviously malicious, just accumulations of administrative imprecision and nobody with the incentive to correct them." He looked at her steadily. What would it take to correct them? "A full survey," she said. "An independent one, not conducted by the provincial offices that have been applying the misclassifications. It would take 8 months and require someone who knows the northern boundaries well enough to read the original surveys against current usage." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her face in the lamplight. The scar caught the light on its long arc, and she had long since stopped noticing when she was in unflattering light. And she did not notice now. And he looked at it the way he always looked at it, which was to say, he looked at her. "Do you want to do it?" he asked. She looked at him. "The survey?" "Yes." He paused. "You know the North better than anyone I have. You understand the law. And it is," he said carefully, "something that matters to you. Not just as work. Something you actually want corrected." She sat with this for a moment, the straightforwardness of being offered something because someone had noticed she wanted it. Not as a gift, not as a gesture, as a logical allocation of available capability. "Yes," she said, "I want to do it." He nodded. "Then we'll design it together." He leaned his head back against the stone. He was very close to her in the narrow space, shoulders almost touching. "Tomorrow." She looked at the documents in her lap. The lamplight flickered. The cold was considerable, but she did not feel it particularly. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She told him the full truth about the night she made the scar on the evening of the 17th day, not the facts. She had told him the facts in the first conversation, in his study, with the afternoon light coming through the window. She told him the rest of it. The part she had not told anyone because there was no one to tell, and also because telling it would have required admitting that the decision, while correct and chosen, had cost something she had not fully allowed herself to account for. She told him that she had looked at herself afterward in the bronze mirror and felt relief and also grief, and that the grief was not for the face exactly but for the version of a future she was closing off, not the arranged match she was avoiding but something vaguer and more human, the possibility of being seen and wanted without condition, which she had been rational enough to set aside because the rational analysis of her situation made that possibility remote anyway, but which had been there, small and persistent, before she pressed the blade. She told him that she had managed the grief the same way she managed most things, by being useful, by working, by directing her attention outward until the inward thing lost its urgency. She told him that this had mostly worked. She told him that mostly was not entirely, and that the gap between mostly and entirely had been particularly present in certain winters and certain moments, and had become something she had learned to live with the way one learns to live with a chronic injury, aware of it, respectful of it, not defined by it. She told him that coming to the capital with the summons had felt, underneath the practical reasoning she had used to explain it to herself, like a response to the gap. Like something in her that was tired of managing had made a decision before the rest of her caught up with it. He listened to all of it. When she finished, the fire was lower, and the lamps were warm, and the sitting room was very quiet. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, "I want to tell you something in return." She looked at him. He had been king since 17. She knew this fact. She had not known what it meant until he told her, the specific texture of it, inheriting a kingdom at the age most people are learning their own edges, having the weight of 10,000 people arranged above you before you had finished becoming yourself. He told her about the 10 years of building competence as a substitute for everything else, about becoming very good at the work of governing, because the work of governing was what was available, and everything else. Companionship, ease, the basic human experience of being known by another person, had been either unavailable or irrelevant to the task at hand. He told her about the years of deliberate solitude that had become habitual and then had become, gradually, something he no longer noticed. About the way you stop registering the absence of warmth when you have been cold long enough. About looking around his own palace on his 28th birthday and realizing that he knew everything about his kingdom and almost nothing about what it felt like to want something for reasons that were entirely personal and without strategic value. He told her that he had felt the bond in the great hall and had looked at her face and felt the scar register not as a defect but as a story, and that the specific quality of his anger had surprised him, not political, not principled, just deeply personal. The anger of someone who looks at a wrong done to a specific person and feels it as if it were done to someone they already know. He told her he did not entirely understand that yet. He was telling her so she would know he was paying attention to it. She sat across from him in the sitting room and listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "We are both people who substituted work for most things for a long time." He looked at her. "Yes, and we are both," she said, somewhat out of practice at the other things. "Yes." His voice was wry, but the wryness was honest. Very much so. She looked at him. She had been looking at him more directly lately, she noticed, holding the eye contact longer, letting the looking be visible, not angling her face in the old reflexive habit. She was not sure when the habit had started to slip. She thought it had something to do with the specific quality of being looked at in return. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to practice." He went very still. His amber eyes were steady on her face. She rose from her chair and crossed the sitting room. She stood before him, and he looked up at her from his chair with the expression she had been cataloging for 17 days and only now could fully read, the contained wanting of a man who has been waiting with great care to be invited rather than assuming invitation. She leaned down and kissed him. It was brief, a press of her lips to the corner of his mouth, not quite the mouth, not quite the cheek, a place between certainty and caution. She felt him go completely still beneath it, the particular stillness of someone receiving something unexpected with enormous attention. She straightened. He looked at her. "Practicing," she said, her voice steady. A slow, real smile crossed his face. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, made it warmer, younger, more human. He reached up and took her hand. "Practicing requires repetition," he said. "I've been told." She felt something move in her chest, warm and specific and unhurried. She sat down on the arm of his chair. He held her hand, and she looked at the fire, and the sitting room was quiet around them, and something that had been braced for a long time began, slowly and carefully, to release. The survey of the northern borders was formally commissioned on the 21st day. She had designed the methodology herself, cross-referencing the original charters from the Treaty Hall with current provincial records and 3 generations of local land usage documentation that existed, scattered and uncatalogued, in various estate archives. It was the kind of project that would normally have required a team of 6 royal surveyors and 18 months of formal process. She had proposed a different approach, 2 independent surveyors with full royal authority, working simultaneously from opposite ends of the contested territory, reporting directly to her rather than through the provincial offices, with a timeline of 9 months rather than 18. Caius had read her proposal, asked 4 specific questions about the methodology, and approved it the same afternoon. She had set to work with the focused energy of someone who has been given a real problem and the actual resources to address it, which was a new experience and which she was not about to waste. She worked in the library most mornings, corresponding with the surveyors and reviewing documentation, and he worked beside her when his schedule permitted and across the palace when it did not, and in the evenings they returned to the sitting room and the fire and the parallel work that had become the architecture of their days. She was kissing him more now. This had developed the way most things developed between them, incrementally and without announcement. Each small step arrived at naturally rather than planned toward. The corner of his mouth had become his cheek had become his jaw had eventually become his mouth properly and completely, and by the 3rd week she had learned that he kissed with the same qualities he brought to everything. Focused, unhurried, genuinely present, no performance whatsoever. She had found this unexpectedly significant. She had not been kissed before. She was aware this was unusual for 24. The scar had done its work there as effectively as everywhere else, and she had told herself for years that this was fine, that she was practical and solitary and did not have the capacity to miss what she had organized her life against. She understood now that she had been wrong about the capacity. She understood this specifically from the way she felt sitting beside him on the stone bench in the eastern garden one afternoon, when he had tucked her hand against his side in the cold air with the absent ease of someone doing something that felt natural and necessary, and she had felt the warmth of it move through her like a tide. On the 25th day, he asked her about her mother. They were riding the eastern ridge, the route that had become habitual, and it came up naturally because she had mentioned something about the estate management style, and he had asked who had taught her, and she had said her mother mostly. And then stopped, and he had waited with his characteristic patience. Her mother had died when Mara was 14, not dramatically, fever in a bad winter, in a province without adequate medical resources, which was a thing that happened in border territories, and a thing that should not happen, and which Mara had decided at 14 to do something about when she had the means. She was still working toward the means. She told him this. He listened. Then he said, "The academy here trains physicians. The capital has 3, and the eastern province has 2. He paused. "The north has none assigned to it formally." "No," she said. "That is a governance failure I inherited and have not corrected," he said. He was matter-of-fact about it, not self-flagellating, not performing guilt, just identifying a gap with the same directness he identified everything. "I would like to correct it. If you have thoughts on the structure, I'd like to hear them." She looked at him as they rode through the pale morning. "You do this," she said. He glanced at her. "Do what? You find the things I care about and you ask what I think about fixing them." She held his gaze. "Not as a gift. You ask because you actually want to know." He thought about this. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you think about the northern territories the way I think about the whole kingdom," he said, with the specific knowledge of someone who has lived with the consequences, rather than just administered from above. He paused. "I have been governing the north for 11 years without knowing what you know. That seems like poor administration." She looked ahead at the valley. "That is," she said slowly, "the least romantic possible framing of what you just said." He almost smiled. She had been cataloging his almost smiles. They were becoming more frequent. "And yet it is the accurate one," he said. She thought about it. "And yet," she agreed. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The sky above the valley was the particular pale blue of early winter, high and clear. She said, "Without looking at him, I would like to stay." He looked at her. She met his eyes. "Not as a practical arrangement," she said. "Not because the bond requires it, or the survey requires it, or because it makes political sense." She paused. "Because I want to. The specific want is mine." He held her gaze for a long moment. His expression was doing the thing she had learned to read now, the opening of something usually contained. "I want you to stay," he said. "For the same reason." She nodded. They understood each other. They rode back through the pale winter morning without ceremony. 2 people who had found something real and were moving toward it without rushing, which was the only way either of them knew how to move toward real things. The bond completed without either of them planning it. This was fitting, she thought afterward. They were not people who planned toward emotional moments. They were people who built carefully and then found that the building had already become the thing. It was the 29th evening. She had been reviewing survey reports, and he had been reviewing Eastern trade correspondence, and the fire had been burning low, and the palace beyond the sitting room had gone quiet in the way it went quiet after midnight when most of the household had retired. She had set down her notes. He had set down his correspondence. They had looked at each other. She had moved to him without deliberation, or rather, with the particular deliberation that feels like instinct because it is the product of careful understanding. She knew what she was doing. She was choosing it. He had looked at her face. All of it. The whole face. the scar in the low firelight, her gray eyes, the expression she was no longer managing. And then, he had done something she had not expected. He had brought his hands to her face and held it, cupped it gently in his large, careful hands, and he had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had turned his lips to the left side of her face to the scar and kissed it. Not a single brief touch. A press, warm and deliberate and absolutely unhurried, beginning at the highest point of the scar near the outer corner of her eye and moving slowly along its length to where it ended at the edge of her jaw. She had gone completely still. She was not prepared for it. She had organized herself against many things for 7 years, and she had not organized herself against this. Against the specific sensation of something she had made in pain being received with tenderness. Against the particular undoing of having the thing she had used to stay invisible treated as something worth being seen. She did not cry. She had not cried at 17, and she did not cry at 24, but she felt the thing that is behind crying, the specific internal movement of something that has been held under careful management for a long time releasing all at once. He felt it. She could tell by the way his hands moved, gathering her in, careful and steady, one hand at her back and one still at her face, holding the whole of her without pressure. She said his name. He said, "I know." She pulled back enough to look at him. His expression was open in a way she had not seen it, not the controlled opening of a man choosing to let something show, but the unguarded openness of someone who has stopped choosing because the choice has already been made. She kissed him. He kissed her back. The bond between them moved like a tide, the same tide that had first made itself known across the great hall's length, and had been building in increments through 29 days of riding and libraries and cold treaty halls and northern land records. And when it completed fully and all at once, a click of certainty that was not new, but was now final. She woke the next morning with his arm around her and the early light coming through the curtains, and the specific quality of warmth that was the warmth of the bond settled and real. She lay in the early light and took stock. She was 24. She was in the capital. She had a survey underway and 14 land misclassifications to correct, and a medical academy to propose for the northern provinces, and a king beside her who had kissed the scar on her face before he kissed her mouth. She had arrived 3 weeks ago with the intention of being declined on grounds of visible defilement, and had not been declined. She had expected proceedings and gotten morning rides. She had expected to be managed, and had instead been asked her opinion on grain distribution. She thought about the 17-year-old who had sat in a cold room with a blade in her hand and made a rational decision, and had been right, fundamentally right, to protect herself. She thought about what that girl had set aside in the process, not with bitterness, but with the clear sight of someone who is finally far enough away from a thing to see it whole. She had set aside the possibility of being known, and she had done it because the alternative had seemed more dangerous than the cost. The alternative was still dangerous. She was not naive about this. Caius was a king, and she was a border lord's daughter, and the court had opinions, and the bond between them was new, and things that were new were fragile in the specific ways that new things were fragile. But she was also 24, and she was tired of organizing herself for safety at the expense of everything else. She had done it for 7 years. She had been very good at it. And now she was here, in this specific warmth, and he was real, and the survey was real, and the northern families with their misclassified land were real, and she was going to choose all of it. He stirred beside her. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and his expression in the unguarded early morning was the one she had seen the night before, open, unhurried, warm. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They lay in the early light for a while longer, neither of them performing, neither of them managing, just present. She told her father by letter. She wrote it herself, without assistance, which was how she wrote everything. She had never found it useful to have words mediated by someone else. She told him plainly, the bond was genuine and accepted. The formal courtship had been compressed by mutual preference into something more practical. The betrothal would be announced publicly within the month. She told him House Aldrich would be recognized, and the estate boundary issues she had been managing for 3 years would be formally reviewed under the new Northern Land Survey she was overseeing. She did not tell him about the scar. She had told no one about the scar except Caius, and she was not going to begin with her father. His response arrived 5 days later. It was warm in the way her father was warm, practical and brief and fundamentally concerned with the estate's security, but warm. He was pleased. He was, she thought, genuinely proud, though he expressed this in the language of advantage and alliance rather than the language of feeling, which was the only language he had ever spoken to her in, and which she had long since learned to translate. Caius read the letter over her shoulder, which he did without asking, which she had stopped objecting to because she had realized the not asking was not presumption, but familiarity. And she was finding that familiarity was different from presumption in ways that mattered. He said, "He doesn't know you very well." She thought about this. "He knew me as useful." There was a pause. "Then I know you as useful too." He said it carefully, acknowledging something. "But that is not most of what I know you as." She looked at the letter. "No," she agreed. "It's not." The betrothal announcement was held in the Great Hall on a Thursday morning, which was the day she had arrived 3 weeks prior, and she thought about that as she stood beside Caius in the hall full of court members and felt the parallel. The same stone floor, the same arched windows, the same amber eyes, and everything else entirely different. He had not asked her to stand beside him. He had asked where she wanted to stand, and she had said beside you, and so that was where she was, close enough that their arms touched. And she could feel the warmth of him and the steadiness of him, and the bond between them like something woven rather than tied. He made the announcement clearly, and without embellishment. The court received it with the polite formal applause that court ceremonies required, and she could see in various faces the various calculations being made, the houses recalibrating their assessments, the advisors who had been skeptical repositioning their skepticism, the younger women who had been brought to the capital for the selection adjusting to an outcome they had not anticipated. She met it all with the steadiness she had always had, which felt different now. Before, her steadiness had been built on distance, the managed calm of someone who has moved through the world at sufficient remove to avoid being fully reached. Now, it was something else. It was the steadiness of someone who is fully present and has chosen to be. After the formal proceedings, he took her hand in the corridor, briefly, before the staff and the advisors closed in around them with the practicalities of post-announcement logistics. She squeezed his hand once. He looked at her. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She meant it. The weeks that followed were full in the way she had not been full in a long time, not busy in the managing way, not occupied in the survival way, but genuinely full. The fullness of someone doing things that matter alongside someone who makes the doing easier rather than harder. The survey was progressing. 2 of the 14 misclassifications had already been resolved with the provincial offices. The Northern medical proposal was in its second draft, and she had begun corresponding with the Capital Academy's head physician about a training exchange program. She worked hard. She had always worked hard. The difference now was that the working was pointed at things she had chosen rather than things she had been given, and there was someone beside her who occasionally appeared in her doorway to say, "Come eat something," or "The Eastern Ridge in an hour if you want," or once. Very simply, "I found a record in the treaty hall you should see." And all of these were, she understood, the same thing said in different languages. She was learning to receive them. She was not yet fluent in receiving, but she was learning, which was more than she had been doing for the previous 7 years. One evening, she came into the sitting room to find him already there, not working, just sitting in the chair with the firelight and a particular quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. She sat down across from him. "What is it?" He looked at her. He had been thinking about how to say something. She could see it in the slight set of his jaw. He said, "I've been thinking about the night you were 17. She waited. "Not as a problem to solve," he said. "Just thinking about it." He paused. "I was 17 when I became king." He said it quietly. "That year, the specific year of being 17, I was doing something impossible with inadequate preparation, and I had no one to ask for help, and everything I did that year I did alone, because there was no alternative." She looked at him. "You were also doing something impossible with inadequate preparation," he said. "Alone, at the same age." She was quiet. "I just wanted to say that I understand something about it," he said. "Not the same thing. A different thing, but the same age, the same alone." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry you had to do it alone." She sat with this for a moment. The fire made small warm sounds. Outside the window, the winter evening had gone fully dark. "I'm less alone now," she said. His expression did something she had never seen it do before, and has no precise name for. It was happiness. Yes, but specific and quiet and real. The happiness of someone who does not have it often, and therefore recognizes it precisely when it arrives. "So am I," he said. The coronation was set for the first week of spring. She approached it with the practical thoroughness she brought to everything, reviewing ceremonial protocol with the household steward, making decisions about the formal processional with the same focused attention she gave the survey methodology, dismissing 2 proposed dress designs as impractical before approving a third that was elegant without being restrictive. She did not find ceremony meaningful in itself. She found it meaningful as communication, as the formal public articulation of something that was already real, and she was therefore willing to do it correctly. Caius watched her work through the ceremonial preparations with an expression she had learned to read as specific appreciation, the particular attention of someone watching competence operate in an unfamiliar domain. She caught him watching once and raised her eyebrows. "You approach everything the same way," he said, "as a system to be understood and optimized." She considered this. "Is that a criticism?" "No," he said. "I do the same thing." She returned to the processional notes. Then, "The florist wants white roses along the main colonnade." She paused. "I want to understand the logic before I approve it." He did not even try to contain the smile that time. On the evening 2 weeks before the coronation, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and let her mind move through the things it wanted to move through, which she had learned was more efficient than fighting it. She thought about the survey. 11 of 14 misclassifications now resolved. The final 3 requiring provincial negotiation she was confident she could complete within the month. She thought about the medical training exchange, which had moved from proposal to preliminary agreement with satisfying speed. She thought about a letter she had received from one of the northern families whose land had been the first restoration. A brief, practical letter, not effusive, just stating that the returned acreage would allow them to expand the grain crop by 30% this season. She had read it 3 times. She thought about the scar. She thought about it differently than she used to. For 7 years it had been primarily a tool, a practical object she wore in service of a specific function. She had made peace with it as a choice, and had not looked past the choice to what the choice was a response to. Now, lying in the dark, she allowed herself to look at all of it, the fear that had been underneath the rationality, the specific grief of a 17-year-old girl who had correctly understood her situation and had done what she needed to do to survive it, and who had paid a price that had been real even though the decision was correct. She thought about Caius kissing the scar. She thought about this with the particular quality of attention she gave things that had moved her, careful, close, not rushing past the feeling to analysis. She had made the scar in order to be overlooked. He had kissed it in order to see her. These were opposite things, and both of them had mattered, and she was still, weeks later, finding the full shape of what it meant that one person had looked at the thing she had used to disappear and had moved toward it rather than away. She was not going to disappear anymore. She was going to stay visible, in this palace, in this life she was building room by room and decision by decision. It was different from the life the scar had been designed to prevent, not better in the sense of being easier, but better in the sense of being chosen, which she was finding was the only kind of better that meant anything to her. The door between their chambers opened quietly. She looked up. Caius stood in the doorway in the dark. He could see she was awake. He had always been attentive to these things. "Can't sleep," he said. No. He came in and lay beside her, and she turned toward him, and he put his arm around her, and she pressed her face against the warmth of his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a while. The palace was very quiet. "I'm thinking about the survey," she said. He made a sound that meant he was listening. "The last 3 restorations," she said. "The provincial negotiation is going to require a direct meeting rather than correspondence. I need to go north." He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "After the coronation." She paused. "A month, probably." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something he wanted to say correctly. "I'll come," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark. "You're the king," she said. "You can't spend a month in the northern provinces for a land survey." He met her eyes. "I can spend a month in the northern provinces reviewing the military installation situation in the Eastern Ridge fortifications, which is a thing I have been meaning to do for 2 years and which conveniently overlaps geographically." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is," she said slowly, "an extremely transparent justification." "Yes," he said. His voice was wry and entirely honest about the wryness. "Is it convincing?" "No." He shifted, pulling her closer. "I don't want you to go for a month alone," he said. "The transparency is intentional. I'm not going to pretend it's purely strategic." She lay against him in the dark and felt the warmth of him and the bond between them, settled and real. "You've gotten better at saying things directly," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. She felt something move in her chest, warm and specific and large and unhurried, the thing that had been building for 37 days without her naming it, which she was naming now with the directness she had always brought to truths even when the truths were difficult. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, without embellishment or ceremony. "I want you to know that not as a coronation gesture and not because the bond requires it. Because it's true." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her in the dark, and his expression was the open, unguarded one she had first seen on the 29th evening, and he said, "I love you," also not as a gesture, also true. She pressed her face back against his shoulder. He held her. The winter outside was ending. She could feel it in the quality of the air even indoors, the particular softening that happens when the hardest part of a season releases its grip. In a few weeks it would be spring, and she would be crowned in a hall full of people, and she would be visible in a way she had spent 7 years learning to avoid, and she was not afraid of it. She was not afraid of being seen anymore. She had been seen already, in a study with afternoon light, by a man who had looked at her face and asked who had done that to her with the specific anger of someone who already considered her his to protect, and she had told him the truth, and he had crouched before her chair and held her gaze and said, "I am not declining." She had been seen, and she had stayed visible, and she was staying. The morning of the coronation arrived cold and bright, which was fitting. She dressed without assistance for the first part, an old habit, and she had asked for it. and her household staff had learned to leave her the first 15 minutes alone. She stood before the mirror in the Queen's suite and looked at herself with the same clear-eyed attention she had stood before the bronze mirror at 17. The same face, and different. The scar was still there, the long, deliberate arc, faded to silver now rather than the angry red it had been in the first years. She had not tried to cover it. She had considered it, briefly, in the initial conversations about coronation dress, and had set the consideration aside. She was not going to stand in the great hall of Valdrin with her face arranged to tell a more comfortable story. She was going to stand in the great hall with her actual face, the one that had been kissed. The processional moved through the palace corridors and into the grand colonnade, and she walked it with the steady, unhurried pace that was hers, looking forward. The great hall was full, every noble house, the diplomatic contingent from 3 kingdoms, the senior staff and the household, and the council members who had had opinions about her presence in the eastern wing on the first morning, and who had, in the weeks since, largely revised those opinions in the specific way people revise opinions when they encounter competence operating in their direct vicinity. She walked the length of the hall. At the altar she could see Caius waiting. He was in formal coronation dress, dark and precise, his dark hair arranged properly rather than in the slightly disheveled state that was his natural condition, and even at this distance she could see his expression, not the public composure of a king performing a ceremony, but his actual face, the one she saw in the sitting room in the evenings, looking at her. She reached the altar. They stood before each other. The hall was very quiet. The ceremony moved around them in the way formal ceremony does when the 2 people at its center are occupying a different and more interior space simultaneously. She heard the words, responded to them at the correct moments, received the crown with the steady practicality she brought to everything. She felt the weight of it settle. She looked at him. He was looking at her face. All of it. The scar in the winter morning light, her gray eyes, the expression she was not managing. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the second day, which was to say he looked at her as the whole of what she was, and then he smiled. The full, real smile she had first seen on the eastern ridge, the one that changed his face, and offered her his hand. She took it. Outside, the city made noise. Inside the hall, 200 people witnessed a queen being crowned who had not been expected, who had arrived with a scar and a survey methodology and 7 years of accumulated competence, and the bone-deep tiredness of someone who had been managing their own disappearance for too long, and had finally decided to stop. She stood in the great hall of Valdrin with the crown on her head and her hand in his, and her face visible in the winter light. All of it. The whole face. The scar that ran from the corner of her eye to the edge of her jaw, silver and deliberate and entirely hers. She had made it in order to be overlooked. She wore it now as something else entirely, as evidence that she had once been 17 and alone and had found a way through. That she had survived the years between then and this with the resources available to her, that survival was not the same as living, and that she had figured this out in time to do something about it. The scar was not the wound. The wound had been the years of choosing distance over presence, safety over the possibility of being known. That wound was healed in a different way, not surgically, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of morning rides and library silences and cold treaty halls and the specific warmth of a man who had kissed the scar before he kissed her mouth. She thought of that. She thought of him crouched before her chair on the first day, his amber eyes steady and his voice saying, "I am not declining." She tightened her hand in his. He tightened back. The ceremony concluded. The court applauded in the formal way of courts. The diplomatic contingent produced the appropriate formal responses. The household staff managed the logistics of the processional exit with practiced efficiency. All of it moved and flowed around them as ceremonies do, performing the public articulation of something already real. They walked out of the great hall into the pale spring corridor, and the sound of the ceremony fell behind them, and they were in the ordinary light of a Tuesday morning in the palace they both lived in now, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She almost smiled. He did smile, the full one, immediate and unmanaged. They walked down the corridor together, not performing and not managing, just present in the specific ordinary way of two people who have chosen each other in full knowledge of what the choosing means and have found the weight of it exactly right. Behind them, the great hall emptied. Ahead of them, the palace opened out into the eastern wing and the library and the sitting room and 11 more land misclassifications, and a medical academy, and a survey that still needed its final 3 restorations, and years of work they would do together, in comfortable parallel, in the particular silence of two people who have stopped pretending and started beginning. She had come to the capital to disappear. She was staying to be seen,